Hello, my name is Grayson Hinton, and this is my presentation on the Battle of Kursk for World War II history. So to start things off, we'll take a look at the general context of the Eastern Front as a whole. So as Americans, we tend to think a lot more just about the US and the Western side of things. With like D-Day and France and whatnot. But in reality, much more of the fighting was done in the East. To help put this into perspective, Germany had roughly 70% of their soldiers and their resources going towards the Eastern Front and just focused on fighting the Soviets. And so, looking more specifically at the Battle of Kursk, it was a major turning point on the Eastern Front. Kind of up until this point, Germany was gaining a good amount of progress, but this was one of the first major wins for the Soviet forces. The Battle of Kursk was the largest tank battle in history, even up until this day, that still stands as the largest tank battle. So, with that being said, we are going to dive into the tanks and armor that was used in it. So, we'll start out with the T-34. Now, one thing with the T-34, the strategy that the Soviets used with it was quite different compared to the strategy that Germany used with their tanks and their armor. So the T-34 was strategized as uh, quantity over quality. So they put their strength in numbers and just sheer volume of these tanks, which gave them an advantage in offensive operations because they were able to use this to kind of overwhelm and bombard enemy defenses with their numbers. And this also gave them good flexibility in their strategy planning with the amount of tanks that they had for this. So the T-34 not only differed in strategy, but also in its general design and features. The T-34 implemented sloped armor, which was pretty different compared to the German strategy. So let's say you have 30 millimeters of steel, and then you slope that. That slope is going to make it more likely that it deflects rounds compared to 30 millimeters of just vertical steel. So because it's sloped and you have the greater effective thickness, you don't have to have quite as much metal on there, which comes with a couple benefits. One of them is it saves weight. So the tank is going to be more maneuverable because it's not as heavy. And then also it will tend to be more reliable because the components of the tank are not as stressed by that extra weight. And in terms of a war, reliability with your vehicles is really important. One of the main tactics that the German army used for their armor divisions was quality over quantity. Their tanks were very well advanced for their time in terms of their overall engineering. But with that being said, they didn't have a ton of them because they were harder to make and actually manufacture. German armor was also the focal point of their famous blitzkrieg tactic that they used throughout the war. Their goal with it was to quickly overwhelm forces combining their tanks, their infantry, and planes. The German army at this time used a couple different tanks in their arsenal, and one of them was the Tiger 1 tank. So, like we said earlier, Germany used a little bit of a different strategy in their armor. They opted in for that more vertical style that you can kind of see in that picture, except they made that vertical armor much thicker. So it was still very hard for any allied attack to actually penetrate it. And on top of this, their guns that they had on these things were really powerful, and they could go through just about any allied tank that they went up against. But with that being said, they generally lacked in numbers, and this was because of a couple different things. One, these tanks were over-engineered. They were very complex and complicated in the way they worked and how they just generally functioned. And because of this, they broke down pretty frequently. They were not reliable, and part of that was because of their overall weight of the armor. To help put this into perspective, the Tiger 1 tank weighed somewhere around 57 tons, and the modern day M1 A1 Abrams weighed right around that too, right around 60 tons. So these things were very heavy for their time. The other main tank that Germany used in their arsenal was the Panzer IV tank, and this made up most of the armor numbers that Germany used at the Battle of Kursk. So because of that, this tank did a lot more of the grunt work, but it was also less advanced compared to the Tiger tank. Its armor was not as good, its gun was not as good. Just overall, it lacked in some of the areas that the Tiger one did not lack. It also struggled to penetrate up armored targets. Also, because its armor was not quite as good, some soldiers made an attempt to up armor it, like you can see in the picture. That armor helped stop certain types of rounds from penetrating on some of their weaker points, like the side. Next, we are going to take a look at some of the things that led up to the Battle of Kursk. And perhaps one of the largest things that led up to it was the Battle of Stalingrad, which took place roughly 5 months before the Battle of Kursk. And this was the largest defeat that the German army had faced up until this point. Their troops were forced to surrender, which is not something they were used to doing before this. And because of that, Soviet forces were starting to gain momentum in a variety of ways in terms of their strategy planning and also the morale of their troops. And on top of this, the German myth of their invincibility was kind of shattered because of that. That battle really proved that the German army was not undefeatable. The Kursk salient was essentially formed from Soviet over-optimism after the Battle of Stalingrad. They were pretty eager to ride on that momentum that they had just gained from that big victory, and go out and take more, which led to the creation of the Kursk salient. And for those that don't know, salient is essentially a bulge or a pocket along the front lines. And in an ideal world, you don't want that because the salient comes with some certain vulnerabilities and weak spots that makes it easier to be attacked and cut off from the sides. And this specific salient was important for both the German and the Soviet forces. The Germans were looking to regain some of their ego that was hurt after the Battle of Stalingrad. They wanted to go out and prove that they were still that top dog. Whereas the Soviets were kind of the opposite. They wanted to prove that the Germans were falling behind and that the Soviets had finally truly regained some of that momentum and that the Battle of Stalingrad was not just a fluke. The German plans and strategies were pretty smart on paper. They broke their attack up into two pieces. They had a northern attack and a southern attack. So, like that map we saw earlier, their goal was to attack from each side of the salient and then essentially pinch off the rest of it, leaving just a bubble of Soviet troops that would be trapped there, unable to get any supplies or anything, basically recreating what the Soviets did to them during Stalingrad. And to do this, they used a couple key figures, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and General Walter Model. Each of these were in charge of their own side of the attack with the North and the South. Taking a closer look at the people who were in command, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was in charge of the southern attack at the Battle of Kursk. One thing to note about him is that this was not his first rodeo. He was pretty well known for his brilliant mind and his brilliant strategic planning. So if anyone was the guy for the job, it would definitely be him. And he was also very well known for his aggressive approach to things. He did not necessarily like to play things safe. He was all about rolling the dice and going out there and getting it, which was quite different to Model's approach that we will get into in just a second. Compared to Erich von Manstein, General Walter Model had a much more cautious approach. And that was partially because he seemed to be a lot more defensively minded, which is primarily what he was used for. He was commonly used in defensive operations. And because of this, he tended to lack in that offensive capability because he was not willing to take some of those risks that Manstein was willing to. And that really tended to show throughout his success or lack of success during his attack on the North. So around this time, with the Battle of Kursk, the Soviets were beginning to take a look at why things weren't quite working out for them in the past. And in the past 2 summers, the Germans had launched a summer offensive. And then in response to that, the Soviets had launched winter counteroffensives. And during these counteroffensives, the Soviets had essentially tried to do too much too quickly. Now, part of that was because Stalin had high demands for his generals at the time. And then another part of it was the generals had an overconfidence in what their troops were capable of and actually doing in those short periods of times. And the Soviets realized that they were overextending their forces, which then led to further problems with their logistical supply lines. Looking more at some of their past mistakes, they began to realize that they didn't quite listen to the intelligence that was given to them previously. Stalin had been warned about previous attacks during Operation Barbarossa, but in a way, he kind of blew them off. He didn't quite listen to them. But now, seeing what was really at stake, Stalin had really committed to halting the German success that they had previously achieved. So, when the spies warned him of the incoming attack on the Kursk salient, Stalin was really all ears and ready to listen this time around. Under most normal circumstances, the German army really should have been able to win this battle, but their problems came essentially from the fact that the Soviets knew this attack was coming. Their intelligence gave them a lot of ahead warning with this. And so what they were able to do is they worked to improve their air superiority odds. They really focused on building up their air force because previously the German Air Force had essentially what was a monopoly in the air. But this time the Soviets realized that they needed to make it a priority to rival them in the air. And so the combination between their rivaling the air superiority of the Germans, their time that they were able to use to build up fortifications, and the lack of the element of surprise is really what helped the Soviets win this. After assessing their previous performances and counteroffensives, the Soviets made a choice to adjust some of their game plans. One big change that they made to their game plans was the fact that Stalin chose to, in a way, limit himself a bit. He did this by giving more freedom towards his staff and his generals to create a war strategy instead of it being more on him. With these war-hardened generals, they were able to set much more modest goals for their army that were really a lot more realistic for them to achieve compared to what was before. On the other side of things, Hitler decided to take the opposite approach with his strategy compared to Stalin. So instead of giving more power to his knowledgeable generals, he chose to raise himself up and give himself more power. At this point, he was pretty unhappy with some of the recent failures that his staff had had, for example, like the Battle of Stalingrad. And so he started to take things into his own hands. And despite a lot of warnings from many of his generals, some of which included von Manstein and Walter Model, about their concerns for this attack and some of their intelligence leaks, Hitler did not listen to them, and he chose to go through with it anyway. So, with how much advanced warning that the Soviets had because of their intelligence, combined with the delays of the German army for this attack, this gave them a bunch of time to really prepare and solidify all of their defenses. So to help put this into perspective with just how much they were able to really set up and fortify this area, the Red Army deployed just under 2 million soldiers, roughly 5,000 tanks, and about 25,000 artillery pieces and mortars into the Kursk salient, which is so much. It's hard to really wrap your head around that. And the Germans were not prepared for this level of defenses at all. I mean, this was just layer after layer of fortifications. On July 5th of 1943, the German offensive began. And leading up to this, only Hitler actually knew the exact day and time that the battle was going to start. So, as part of him increasing his control, not even his generals knew the exact day or time, and neither did the Soviets. They just knew the rough general time. So, Hitler told his generals the finer details of the attack through a tea house invite. And despite his generals feeling uneasy about the plans and timing, he went through with it anyway. And later on, the generals' uneasy feelings would be proved right. So one German tank commander is quoted saying, "What happened at Kursk was unbelievable. I've never experienced anything like it in war, either before or since. The Soviets has prepared a defensive system whose extension and depth was inconceivable to us. Every time we broke through one position in bitter fighting, we found ourselves confronted with a new one." When it came to the northern attack, it was General Walter Model that was in charge of it. And the best way to sum up the northern side of things is that it really was just a complete failure. Uh, General Model was simply not prepared for the level of fortifications that he was about to have to go up against, and neither were his troops. And both sides of the fight faced heavy, heavy losses. It wasn't just the Germans that were getting their butts kicked. Both sides were taking heavy casualties and heavy equipment losses. But by the fifth day of the attack, the Germans had already lost more men and more machines than they actually had replacements for. They really lacked the ability to keep a steady flow of resources and men to the front lines in the north to actually keep this fight going. When it came to the southern side of things, it fared much better for the Germans compared to the north. And part of that was because it was being run by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who generally did a better job on offensive missions compared to Model. He was more willing to take some calculated risks compared to Model. The southern side of things was really the best way to describe it is a dogfight. The fighting was pretty brutal. The Germans were able to advance roughly 30 miles during their attack, thanks to their smarter strategy and heavier use of armor, but that was still nowhere near their original goals of linking up with the northern forces. So one of the major battles that was within the Battle of Kursk was the Battle of Prokhorovka, which happened on July 12th of 1943. And this battle actually came as part of Manstein's southern attack of the German forces. And this was kind of widely regarded as the actual largest tank battle in history. And one thing to note with this is that there wasn't necessarily a clear winner. It's kind of more regarded as a stalemate than a decisive victory. But this battle still, regardless, helped the Soviets gain some traction and keep the winning going. One thing that we need to keep in mind as we're diving into some of the numbers of this battle is the fact of inflation. As we've kind of seen throughout history, not just this battle, but in general, the winning side does tend to get to write the history books. And with that comes some inflation of numbers. So their inflated numbers at this battle will tell you there was somewhere between 1,200 to 1,500 tanks that came together and fought, when in reality it was a bit less than that. It was more around 600 actual tanks, and then somewhere around 2,000 total combat vehicles that were involved in this specific battle. So the Battle of Prokhorovka began on July 12th, and it initially actually started with the Germans doing a little bit of a preemptive bombing run with some of their aircrafts. And then the Soviets responded to that with large amounts of artillery and then proceeding to move forward with their tanks. Now, in this battle, the Germans had a little bit of an advantage because of their better and more powerful main guns on their tanks, and their tanks also had better optics. So they were able to shoot a little bit more accurately, and their guns were capable of shooting at greater distances. But during this battle, the Soviets' numbers is what helped them out. A German soldier is quoted as saying there was too many to count as the tanks were rushing towards them. Uh, and much like a lot of other battles, this was still pretty gritty. And one thing to help put it into perspective is when tanks get hit, they could oftentimes basically just turn into pressure cookers, launching the turret up into the air. That's you got a 10, 15 ton turret that gets launched into the air. That takes quite a bit of pressure. And as you can probably imagine, the crews that are inside of that don't are not having a great time. So while this battle is mostly known as a big tank battle, there was also quite a bit of fighting going on in the air between the German and the Soviet forces, really fighting for that air superiority. And while on the ground, the Germans were able to make some initial success in their efforts. It didn't last real long. Things kind of got bogged down as the Soviets continued their counteroffensives, and the Germans were running low on materials and tanks and everything because of how brutal of a battle this was for both sides. And this led Manstein to go directly to Hitler and essentially beg for reinforcements of more armor, more troops, just about more everything. He thought if he could get more of this, then he had a better chance. But with what he had, there wasn't much of a chance. While Hitler initially said yes, he eventually went back on what he said just after and denied Manstein these reinforcements that he was looking for. And so this led the German army to lack in these things, and they couldn't do much, which ultimately led to a stalemate, and the Germans had to exit. So, as the Soviets saw the opportunity with the German army stalling in the north, they decided to launch what was called Operation Kutuzov, which was the first of two counteroffensives. The next one was the one launched in the south, which we'll get to in a second. So this offensive targeted the Orel salient, which was held under German control in the north. The Soviets went in with the goal of encircling and destroying the German Second Panzer Army. Now, well, the Germans they did have this area pretty well fortified. Um, the Soviets launched their attack from a couple different directions. Instead of just focusing on one point, they were able to spread out their attack, which then forced the Germans to spread out their defenses, which ultimately is what led to their success. And then by August 5th, the Soviet troops had captured Orel, and then the operation had officially come to a close on August 18th when the German forces were pushed back and neutralized. In a similar manner to Operation Kutuzov, the Soviet forces decided to get on the move on the southern side of things when they launched the Belgrade-Kharkov offensive operation on August 3rd of 1943, which had the goal of liberating the towns of Belgrade and Kharkov from their German occupation. The Soviets really wanted to destroy the German 4th Panzer Army and the Army Detachment Kempf, which were stationed around these areas. And at this point, both of these forces had been pretty weakened during the Battle of Kursk. And this was a very large scale battle. The Soviets had deployed right around 1 million troops to go towards it, and the Germans had about 200,000 troops in the area. So even though the Germans were very outnumbered, they were still able to put up a good fight because they had these areas pretty well fortified and entrenched. So both sides ended up suffering very heavy losses, but it ended in the Soviet victory liberating both of these towns. The real brutality of war is pretty hard to convey. So the best way, I think, to do that is to take a look at the casualties and the losses on both sides. Um, the Soviets had lost throughout World War II about 24 million lives, and that included both civilian losses and soldier losses. The soldier losses made up about 8.8 million of those lives. And to help put that into perspective, that's 17.6 million mothers and fathers who never got to see their sons again after they left for the war. And Germany lost about 8 million lives in total, including, again, both civilian losses and their soldiers. Their soldiers made up about 5.5 million of those losses. And then as we break it down into just the Battle of Kursk alone, the Soviets are estimated to have lost about 800,000 lives, whereas the Germans lost about 200,000 lives. Now there is that saying that war is hell, and that is a pretty accurate statement. There oftentimes isn't much of a winner in a war when you're dealing with these kinds of losses of lives. The Battle of Kursk had a very big impact on diminishing the German offensive capability. This was really the turning point in the war that shifted the tides into the Soviet favor. This halted any momentum that the Germans still might have had after the Battle of Stalingrad. So this was kind of really the nail in the coffin for them. And it paved the way for more Soviet counteroffensives in the future. And then on top of this, around this time, the Allies were invading Sicily. So Hitler had to divert his attention off of being entirely on the Eastern Front and now focus more on the Allies' attacks as well. And on top of this, they really struggled to replenish the many losses that they had throughout this battle. There was a pretty big gap between the expectations that the Germans had going into the Battle of Kursk versus their actual reality that they ended up facing. The Germans went into it thinking that their well planned out blitzkrieg tactics would be able to get through any Soviet defenses that they would be able to put up. And on top of this, they thought that just about everything with the German army was superior, between their strategies to their armor, while their tanks and everything was better engineered. Um, they acknowledged that they didn't have the number advantage, but they thought that because their tanks were better engineered, that it would make up for the lack of numbers. And they also were known for their mastery of mobile counterattacks, which they thought would really help along the way. But in reality, they did not count on the Soviets being as prepared as they were, with the intelligence that they had received. And their superiority that they once had was simply not as great, as their capabilities had diminished over the course of the war. And lastly, their quality could not overcome Soviet quantity like they were really expecting it to. So the victory at the Battle of Kursk had a pretty big impact on future Soviet offensives. One of the big impacts it made was a boost to the Soviet morale and momentum. This really showed the soldiers what they were capable of doing, and it showed that there was some light on the horizon. They were no longer having to fight from a behind position like they were for the most part before this. And it also proved that the Soviets could really fight outside of the winter months. Most of their counteroffensives in the previous years had been just during those cold, snowy winter months, but this was the summer. So this showed that they could fight without the snow to kind of back them up. And it also led to some strategy changes. They were able to use some of the lessons that they learned from this war or from this battle and their previous battles in some of their future operations, like Operation Bagration. The outcome of the Battle of Kursk was really the mark of the start of the downfall of the German superpower. At this point, Germany struggled to get any other large scale offensive attack going, and that was in part due to their absolutely just decimated resources. At this point, they had lost more soldiers, more tanks, more vehicles than they could really replace. And then this combined with what the Allies were now ramping up, Germany did not have the resources to have both fronts going strongly. So at this point, the ball was now starting to shift into the Soviet courts, where they could really control their offensive strategies a lot better. So to kind of wrap things up, we'll just get a little recap of some of the things we went over that made an impact. One of the big ones was Hitler's role versus Stalin's role. Hitler kind of began to step up and take over some of his leadership at this point, which was not smart. Hitler was not a good military leader at all. He did not have a very military mind, but he still went anyway, took that role. whereas Stalin, he kind of realized he didn't have the greatest military mind, and so he gave more power to his generals, which turned out to be a very good move because they obviously had much more knowledge as they were war hardened. And then the other one was quality versus quantity. With their armor strategy, sometimes quality is not enough to overcome sheer quantity. Sometimes power is in the numbers, like it was in this case. And then the other big thing that impacted it was the intelligence. The German army was pretty underprepared for what they were going up against, but the Soviets, knowing what was coming and roughly when it was coming, had plenty of time to become pretty over-prepared with all of their defenses and strategies. And then the outcome of this battle really opened things up for future offensives for the Soviet Union. Yeah, thank you for watching. That's all.